for pastors and the kind of challenges they are facing. Open Hands really focuses on healthy pastors, creating healthy teams, which impact church moving toward health, and then a healthy church really has an opportunity to make an impact in the community. And so that's really where we operate from. Been really thankful for these past several years. And at this point, we've been, Open Hands has been going for about 9 years already, which is surprising as I look back.
Thank you, Eldon. It's great to have you on here on this podcast. You come with such breadth of experience in interacting on a day-to-day, regular, ongoing relationship with pastors, but including pastors who you've known over a long period of time. So you come from, as you have with me, watching me function as a pastor, as a person over a period of time. I'm interested in what you are seeing among pastors these days, and as you hear of the broader landscape of the church, what are you understanding? What is the dilemma facing pastors in the midst of COVID, and also in the midst of this broader theme that I've been working at of a church dismantled, where so much seems to be falling apart in the church these days?
Well, 20 years ago, I was working with an international ministry that had a phone line for pastors and their spouses in trouble. We saw that in a matter of months go from 100 calls a month to 800 calls a month, and which indicated to me that pastors were in trouble 20 years ago. But there's been an increased tension in these last several years, and particularly in this year, where COVID has struck. And it seems like what I'm hearing from pastors is some of the things that they had relied on in terms of how to evaluate their church, how to program, how to even pray, seem to be crumbling. And at that point, it's created a great angst in many pastors who aren't just sure how to respond to this. And congregations also are confused. So leadership is challenging in a time where there's a lot of uncertainty. Planning, as usual, doesn't seem to work well. So how do you lead into those kind of times?
Eldon, this is not a question we had on the record, but it's one I'm interested in. You have this long breadth of history of watching pastors and pastoral ministry. Do you think there's a period of time where we would have coped with this more productively, or I think my question is were there already weaknesses in the church that you could identify that really make this that much more difficult, a challenging time to lead? I mean, how did you see the church before this?
Yes, I think there were weaknesses within the church. I've been reading Rich Vlahada's book, The Deeply Formed Life. I think he identifies some that actually existed before, that oftentimes that we become more a reflection of our culture. And our culture in many ways has been fairly surfacey in terms of relationally. And I think that was something that was true in churches. It's fairly significantly easy to walk in and out of a church today and never have a meaningful conversation. But you're there because you might like the music or the pastor or the kids program, those kind of things. But that was a weakness, I think, in the church that hasn't been helpful in this kind of transition. I think another piece of that is that, the racial issues have become really strident at many levels within the life of a congregation. And for a pastor to lean into that is something that oftentimes, particularly in evangelical world, often wasn't happening, where they weren't mentioning the challenges that were there for brothers and sisters of color. I think there were other kinds of things that were there. I think that oftentimes we separated the spiritual from our whole personhood, and that is an undermining factor in the life of the church. And so we often didn't see the connect between what happened on Sunday morning and what happened on Monday morning. And some of the evaluations, frankly, of discipleship over these last several years, within the life of strong churches, has had to admit there really isn't the transformation that we were looking for in those programs. So I think there was some weaknesses within the framework of the church. And then just the fact that some of it was built around personalities, and all of a sudden you're a personality that can't spread your personality because of the isolation of COVID. Those are factors that I think has weakened the church before all this really hit even.
One of the things we actually were talking about earlier today is just the challenge in particular with the kinds of things pastors leaned on to be renewed, to take care of their soul. So many ways are not there at this time. Can you say more about that?
Yes, I think that there are things that we have, for instance, oftentimes it's been attendance, a lot of discussion about church growth, the importance of church growth, a lot of importance on how we organize to sustain or strategize to build on church growth. And when it's challenging to meet, it's challenging to have those conversations, and it's really challenging to figure out if we actually are growing or not. And so one of the measurements that's been there just isn't there. Another factor that one of the pastors I met with about a week ago suggested that he's a leader type person, and really an excellent communicator, but in the isolation of COVID and taping and all this kind of thing, the feedback loop is not there. And he just said, I think I'm a leader, but I'm not sure anyone's following right now. I think those are factors that before you could lean on that, there could be people who would surround you with feedback. And I know that some of that's done in Zoom today and Zoom form groups. But I think it's really challenging for that to happen. And oftentimes the people in those Zoom groups are isolated from the rest of the congregation. So it isn't like you have feedback from a larger congregation. It may be however many people you surround yourself with. And so there is a lot of isolation.
And typically in leadership and pastoral ministry, there's isolation already.
Yes.
So that isolation has just extended itself during this time. Yeah.
And I think the other piece that is kind of, we've skirted around, but has been the whole technological piece. I mean, I remember meeting with a bishop who said he looked back in one of the files of a former bishop and he realized there was like a 2-week pause between when he received a letter and when he finally responded to it. In today's world, if you get, and he was saying this, if he got an email or a text at 10 o'clock at night and hadn't responded by 8 o'clock in the morning, people were asking him, what's wrong? What do we need to do? And the other side of that is that there's also these anonymous type, well, if you don't fully agree with me, then you're the enemy. And that's something that, people have been in churches for 40 years, and now because maybe around the masking issue, maybe around the racial issues, maybe around the political issues, if it seems like you're not 100% on with me, I'm out of here. I mean, you basically are throwing away 40 years of relationship because of one thing. And that may be an important thing, but to destroy a whole community in your life, I think those are really hard for pastors to watch and to process.
They are hard because I think as pastors, we take seriously the focus on the community. We recognize that we're aware we are responsible for the health of the whole. And so I think our focus may be more on the community than the typical person in the pew who's focused on perhaps what they need or what they want, or and so when people leave without recognizing the value of the community, I think that's particularly difficult for pastors who've focused on that.
I really agree with you, and the research seems to be saying that, and that's what I'm hearing from pastors, that here's somebody that you not only performed their wedding, but you performed their children's wedding,
Yeah.
and they're walking out the door, and that at some point, if things return to at least semi-normal, you're likely to see them in the grocery store, that kind of thing, but the relationship really has changed. I think the other piece of this is that pastors um, tended to be trained around the whole concept of there are certain things we build on. There's some things that are certain, but uncertainty today really has undermined the whole idea of how do I strategize, how do I program, how do I plan. Can I even do that? Because I don't know what the future holds. And so pastors seem to carry a heavy load of uncertainty in their backpack.
I was struck, Eldon, by how you define the things that are missing for pastors are the metrics. Part of it was missing is the metrics that we relied upon: church attendance, baptisms, budget. But part of my whole thesis in the Dismantled Church, or Church Dismantled, is that part of the weakness of the church is that we've created these rational pieces, that we've become institutions and organizations that have defined our existence and our health and who we are by these rational metrics. And
Yes.
so I guess the one part of me wonders is this the best thing that could be happening to the church, in the sense that we're losing these rational metrics, and somehow we're going to have to measure who we are as followers of Christ on something else, besides maybe how the rest of the world measures what is successful or not. I don't know. What are your thoughts?
I strongly resonate with that. And particularly because I meet with a lot of younger pastors. And truthfully, Barna, all the other researchers of the church say that there's an exit of young people. And the church has not paid attention to that because we've been fairly comfortable. And so why do we need to change? But truthfully, there's been these voices of change that were already out there. And now, as some of the things that we have built on, maybe rationally, we've ignored the relational. And been reading, for instance, in neurotheology, and on one side is really that very cognitive side, but on the other side, which really impacts our decisions, is much more relational, much more intuitive. And it seems like we have really functioned on the cognitive. There was a period where I was a college pastor. I don't know how many people came on campus and said, "Eldon, can I have 10 more minutes? If I can just get more information to these students, they will change forever." And that didn't happen. That isn't what changes people. But it's been difficult for us to accept that. Yeah.
In my social theory course, we talk about the opposite poles of rational and non-rational. I think so often in the modern world we think it's rational and irrational, but it's not. The non-rational is the habits, the traditions, the relationships, the softer part of who we are, and that's the part that I think has been, you're saying, has been minimized.
Yes.
Too often in the church, as we've really looked at these more rational measures of who we are.
Yeah, I think it really is, and we do know the relational is really important, Conrad, and we've minimized it. And really, if we think about the structure of most church services, very little relationally happens. Probably the most relational place is those that serve coffee before you come in, and now we can't do that during COVID.
Right.
So the relational aspect, and I'm part of a congregation that has begun to meet. They're masked. You have to reserve a seat because there can only be so many people in the sanctuary. But you walk in without saying anything and walk out without saying anything. And there's no cup of coffee to sit around and talk, or stand around and talk, as it might be. And so even the relational piece of Sunday morning, let alone, the interaction within the community, that kind of thing, is really challenging and often just missing.
Yeah. Eldon, what are your suggestions to pastors these days as to how they care for their soul, as to how they sustain themselves through this time?
One of the things that even as I went through this time, I really committed myself to saying, well, this is a good time to dig a little bit deeper, spend more time reading, more time praying, those kind of things. And then I found I wasn't too far into it. I recognized that wasn't happening in my life. And yet that's really key. And so beginning to think, okay, uh, there's an absence of some of the old rhythms, but I need to develop and recognize what's happening now are new rhythms, and how do those foundational pieces fit into my life. And I think that's really the call of this season is, how do I come back to some things that are very foundational, the kinds of values that aren't going to change whether we go to a Sunday morning service or not. What are those? What are the kinds of things that I and my family are committed to, no matter whether we get to sit in a pew or we have to sit on our living room couch and listen to uh, uh, a pre-recorded service. And I think that that's something that's really challenging right now, is what are the foundations? I had a friend as this began, and someone asked him, he's a faculty member at a seminary, asked him, well, what practices are going to change in your life? And he said, I don't think any of them are. I've been doing these to build a strong foundation. Now, I'd have to say that sometimes has been missing, or the one piece that we have cut corners on at times. And part of my personal belief is that in some ways, building a spiritual formation life isn't something that's always praised. There's a lot more recognition that comes from some of the other more observable and measurable responses of pastors. And so coming back to what really is solid and foundational, I think is really important.
As you're talking, I hadn't thought about this before, Eldon, but if we've set ourselves up to have outcomes that are rational, we're going to build practices personally that are rational, that are going to, that we think will meet and produce those outcomes. But if we begin to say those rational outcomes are no longer in existence, maybe it does allow us to say, how do I build my life with God, which is so less measurable in the
Yes.
short term, but always measurable in the long term.
Yeah.
There are no saints without a life with God, I like to say.
Yeah, I think that's right, Conrad. I like that. And I think there's a simple tool that's been part of my life that I think has really helped through this season, and it's an ancient. It's an ancient tool called the Examen, or the Examine, depending on what your background may be. But it's that kind of thing where you go back through and reflect, where were those places through my day that I was aware of God, and those places where I wasn't. Maybe some of the saints of the past called it consolation and desolation. Where was I experiencing consolation because God was present, even surprised me? And where were those places of desolation where I just wasn't aware of God, and God's silence seemed to be very real? And I have found that to be a really helpful tool, particularly in this season, to be able to reflect on, as I look back over my schedule of the day past, and reflect on that and pray over it. That's been really helpful to kind of inform me in this season.
The years that I have looked to you for direction have really impacted the time I have with God. I think I moved much more away from seeing it as time that I must put in, like I'm checking into work, or I'm clocking into work, and then I'm clocking out. I'm clocking into God, and then I'm clocking out. But they used to be such moments of shame for me, and I'll never forget the moment when you said to me, "God doesn't shame you." It was a powerful moment for me, and has helped me tremendously in just resolving some of that, most of the shame that I felt when I sat before God, which was an uncomfortable place to feel shame. And I also remember what you said once about, I think it was a particularly dry period for me in my time with God. And you said, you don't have to do it the same way all the time. Maybe you want to go out to the trail and go biking, or maybe you want to go fishing. And just again, that awareness that my life with God extends beyond that hour in the day with God to my whole life with God, Eldon. And I think if we practice that in a moment like this, that's so helpful in sustaining us across the days and the years, the weeks, whatever this is going to be. So I appreciate that. I'm very grateful for that.
Oh, thank you, Conrad. And I just listened to a podcast this morning by a dear friend who's doing a series of teachings, and he was just talking about how, rather than creating add-ons that often can become very legalistic, how do we incorporate that into what we might already be doing? And he mentioned, as you mentioned, if you're going to be writing for a while, use that as a time of silence. If you're walking in the woods, use that for attentiveness and just reminders of God's message through nature, as it talks about in Romans. As husband and wife, those steps can be a place of important conversations that maybe we avoided before the pandemic struck. These are really, really important, I think. Yes.
So if pastors are going deep, or to go deeper with God, how do we take our members there, Eldon, in a time like this? Any thoughts about that?
Well, I have thoughts, but it's challenging for sure because but I think there's a couple things. One is creating those places, even in services. Sometimes when we do the recordings, do we pause and actually have a moment of silence in that space? Can we do that and find that helpful, modeling for the congregation that this might be a helpful practice at a season like this when there are so many things being thrown at us? The other part is realizing that there is community, and that community is reaching out in some creative kind of ways. I have a plaque on my wall that was given to me by a very dear friend, and it says, "Imagination is evidence of the divine." Reminding people that in this time when there is confusion and chaos, to be still long enough to allow our imagination to engage and find those creative ways to be able to say to fellow believers, or those that may not even be identify as followers of Christ, or even indicate a hunger, that we care about them, we actually love them. And there are simple ways in a time when people almost look fearful. If you go into a grocery store and you get closer than 6 feet, they look at you like, oh my goodness, this could be a really bad moment. And I understand that caution, but to be able to communicate to people that you do care, even across those distances, and thinking about that. And there's a variety of ways that can be done in very simple ways. But I think that's going to be key for us moving forward.
Mm-hmm. Eldon, thank you for that. I'd like to ask you one more question before I ask if there's anything else, but you read the best books of anyone I know. So what are you reading right now that might be helpful for our listeners? I'm putting you on the spot, but
yeah, no, that's fine. That's fine. On Street Finders, I'm this intellection that I'm going to read till I die, I guess. But there's some books that really have touched me deeply. One is Todd Bolsinger. Because I grew up in the mountains of Idaho, his first book was called Canoeing Up the Mountains, and it was providing spiritual lessons out of that journey to the Pacific Ocean. And now he's written a second book called Tempered Resilience, which I think this is a season where, because of the heat of the moment and even the anger that sometimes has come out, we're being tempered. And will we allow that to strengthen us, or will it dissolve us? So that's a book. He's an author that I greatly appreciate. There's another author that I've come to appreciate right now. His name is Rich Villodas, and he's written a book called The Deeply Formed Life. And he talks about particularly 5 things that he has seen in the culture and how the culture has invaded the church. And then the following chapter, after each one of those are identified, he talks about practices that he himself and his congregation are engaging there in Queens, New York. And it's just a very inviting book. It's not saying I have all the answers. It's a willingness to be honest in the engagement. And then there's a third book that I've really enjoyed. It's called Rare Leadership, written by Jim Wilder and Marcus Warner. And it's and really the simple thing, rare stands for that reconnecting relationally. And then the A is authentically being yourself. I think that's something that pastors are being challenged to in this season. Can we be authentic? Because we're not in the place where we can please everybody. Somebody's going to be displeased on the right or the left, or on one issue or another issue. And being authentically ourselves, I think, is a great word for this season that we're in.
Thank you, Eldon. I would say that has been fruit that I have been blessed with in my relationship with you as my spiritual director, that I think there's an authenticity that you help to draw out of folks. Just affirming who we are, who we've been created in God's image to be. And I'm very grateful for that, for the gift that you have given to me in that.
Well, thank you, Conrad. What a privilege it's been to walk along beside you. And I feel the same with other folks who've reached out, and we do one-on-ones and do some retreats. And it's just been, it's been a privilege to walk with. And I suppose in this season of my life, even to step back a bit more than when I was running 90 miles an hour in my life, to stop and reflect a bit more. And I have found that, for instance, the journaling, the early morning kinds of things, and I know there's nothing sacred about the early morning. It can be in the evening or the noon hours, or those seasons through the day. But that's a very meaningful time for me. And as well as scripture and prayer has been that we've moved out into the country and live on a couple of acres of trees. And while that's created new levels of work and concern at times in windstorms, it certainly is a place where we can again see God's handiwork and find a restfulness that maybe in the middle of some things we didn't. And yet I still remember the very first spiritual retreat I did. It was in downtown Philadelphia with a group of pastors who were all inner city pastors. So I'm convinced you don't have to move to 2 acres to really experience God in good ways.
Well, that's a good thing for most of us. Eldon, thank you.
Thank you, Conrad. I hope that this was helpful, and
that was very helpful,
and certainly am prayerful and excited about what you're saying, because I think there is this message. There is a message of hope with the kingdom restored.
Yeah.
And actually the church being dismantled, because we were losing our young people, and my heart goes out to them, and to think maybe we can see the kingdom restored in a way that challenges them to come along with us and find new ways of honoring the God that we serve.
Well, you're one who is encouraging us in that journey. Thank you
All right.
for
Thank
being
you.
a father, a mentor, a director to so many of us. God's blessing to you, Eldon.
Well, thank you, Conrad.
And have a blessed Thanksgiving. You and
Well,
your
you as well, and
okay.
enjoy it. Yes.
All right. Thank you so much, Eldon. Blessings.
Blessings to you.